In a quiet corner of rural Lancashire lies this ancient chapel, parts of which date from the 12th century. Inside the chapel lies a mystery. This floor stone, embossed with only a cross, probably marks a burial place beneath. The mystery is, whose resting place is it? York, a thriving important city today, as it was in medieval times and in Tudor times. During the reign of Mary Tudor in 1556, a Thomas Middleton and his wife had a baby girl, who they christened Margaret. Thomas was a chandler by trade, and they lived in the Davy Gate. In her childhood, Margaret would have been brought to this church, St Martin le Grand, on nearby Coney Street.
We're standing in St Martin le Grand, Coney Street, or to be absolutely specific, we're standing in one of the side aisles of it because it was bombed with an incendiary, a German bomb, in 1942. And the original main aisle of the church is where Margaret Clitherow, as a child, would have worshipped, is to my right here. This church has a lot of associations with Margaret's upbringing and life. Her father, Thomas Middleton, was a wax chandler. He made candles. And obviously, with the coming of the Reformation in York, and especially the strong Protestant bias, which in the 1560s was apparent and had also been in the reign of Edward VI, he found this was actually bad for business. He himself, like a lot of York people, tended to sit on the fence on the religious issue. This was a matter for the Crown and the bishops to sort out between them, and understandably I can see his point of view. He died old and disillusioned and suffering from gout in 1564. He was church warden here, and he would have often conducted his family to worship here. Now his daughter, Margaret Middleton, as she then was baptized here in the spring of 1556. And she was married here at the age of only 15 in the July of 1571. So this church had a lot of associations with her family and with her start in life. This is the statue of Margaret Clitherow in St Wilfrid's Catholic Church, which is just opposite the Minster in York. And we see Margaret wearing the coif of a married woman. It was customary in the 16th century after marriage to wear a certain sort of headgear if you were a woman to distinguish you from the unmarried. So here is Mrs. Clitherow, and we might say perhaps just a few words about her married life. She married John Clitherow, who was bridge master over the Ouse and a wholesale and retail butcher in the July of 1571. He was in his 40s and she was only 15. Today we'd regard that as preposterous and criminal, but in the 16th century that kind of age gap was perfectly accepted and regarded as perfectly normal. The marriage, in fact, was a success. She brought up her husband's two children by a previous marriage. His wife Matilda had died, and she had two children by him of her own, Henry and Anne, and was always regarded as a good mother, a good housekeeper, and above all a good wife. It's worth stressing that people from Margaret's background were trained to run a household and a business, but a young woman was not taught to read or write. And it's very significant that she's actually holding a book here, which, let us say, for the sake of argument, was the 1582 Catholic translation of the New Testament made at Douay, because Margaret, during her time in prison, and she was in prison many times between 1577 and her execution in 1586, learnt to read and write. And this was very much a step which was unusual for the time, and she also gave a very high priority for learning so that her stepchildren and children were properly taught, and she kept a schoolmaster in her house in the Shambles, Brian Stapleton, who educated the children.
After her marriage, Margaret Clitherow lived here in the Shambles, where her husband John had his butcher's shop.
This is the shrine, number 36, the Shambles in York. This actually is not the house where she and her husband and her family lived. And the street was called the Shambles because it was where the butchers slaughtered their meat. And in fact, the whole street would have been an abattoir. There would have been blood running down the gutters. There would have been offal which would have been thrown onto the ground, and the place would have smelt to high heaven, especially in summer, and would have been swarming with flies. So this was the environment where Margaret lived. She was a good housekeeper, and she ran the business, the retail side of the business, for her husband John. John Clitherow was away buying meat, buying animals. He had a farm at Cornborough, and he was in fact making a lot of money. Every morning Margaret would come down, open the shutters of the shop in the Shambles, set out the meat and sell it. And she ran the shop extremely effectively. Anything she did and turned her hand to, she did competently. One thing I think that is important to say, in that in her house in the Shambles, there were a lot of young people. She was primarily a wife and mother.
But behind this outward conformity, Margaret Clitherow had converted to the old Catholic faith, abandoning her Protestant upbringing. She and close friends used the house as a mass centre, and she gave refuge to fugitive priests. By a Privy Council Act of March 1585, this latter became a treasonable offence. Within days of passing the Act, the house was raided by the already suspicious authorities.
A Flemish boy was actually staying with them, and the Flemish boy, on the famous raid of the 9th of March 1586, showed the sheriffs of the city of York where the mass vestments were hidden. What happened was Margaret was running the shop, John was being interviewed at the King's Manor and trying to secure his wife's good behaviour, i.e. to make her go to church and so on, in the Anglican sense. And at that particular time they took away the vestments as a sign that Mass was being said. This was a home, a butcher's shop and a Mass centre, and it wasn't exactly in this building, it was across the road. This is in exactly the right place to give you some idea of the environment in which John Clitherow and other butchers worked in the 1580s.
Queen Elizabeth's government in the north of England was in the hands of the Council of the North. This body, under the leadership of Henry Hastings, Earl of Huntingdon, met in the King's Manor in York. Emeritus Professor of Medieval History at the University of York, Clare Cross, is in the council room and outlines the political situation facing the council at that time.
What dangers was Elizabeth facing, or can you help us to actually put those in perspective? I mean, the arrest of Margaret Clitherow, which was on the 12th of March 1586, what is the general conspectus of the European and English situation at that particular time, politically?
Well, I mean, England was at war with Spain, a great Catholic power, and a power that militarily was far, far stronger than England. I think there's an awful lot of hindsight because if you like, the Spanish Armada failed. But very interesting at the time, it was because of the intervention of God and the way the winds blow. It wasn't that we, the English, were stronger than Spain, but that England was at war with Spain. There was a great fear among the Protestant intellectuals that Elizabeth might be assassinated. And again, hindsight, we know that she wasn't assassinated, but the previous year, William the Silent, the great Protestant hero in the Netherlands, where some Englishmen had been fighting on the Protestant side, he'd been assassinated. Had Elizabeth been assassinated in 1586, the nearest heir was the Catholic Mary Queen of Scots, who was still alive, and there was great fear of what Mary Queen of Scots might do, and had she become a queen, I mean, there might have been a second reign of Queen Mary, all the legend of Bloody Mary and so on. So there was a great amount of Protestant fear, I think, at this time.
What was the attitude of the government, especially the Council of the North here, with Elizabeth's cousin, the third Earl of Huntingdon, Henry Hastings, as its chief? What were, he met in this very room with his councillors, what was their attitude to this phenomenon of the priests coming from abroad, of staying in Margaret's house and the houses of other women and men like her?
Well, I mean, there was great fear of the Catholic priests, particularly of Jesuits. And the fear was not entirely without some justification. I mean, we know that Robert Parsons, for example, was in negotiation with the King of Spain, and there was plotting going on. I think it seems very likely that priests were forbidden from discussing politics when they're in England, but even so, I think the governing class had reason to be very much afraid of them. And I think it was the priests of which the campaign very much in the north, and the searches for priests. The laity, if you like, were incidental to this. And I think that Margaret Clitherow, whether she was very much known, I think, to members of the Council of the North of this state. Yes, she had been imprisoned several times for her recusancy, for not going to church, but not going to church was not a hanging, or was not a capital offence at all.
No. You could be heavily fined for it.
Oh, indeed, yes.
Certainly, for most people on those sorts of income, the fines were punitive, weren't they?
They were, but they weren't very often enforced because they couldn't be. I mean, imprisonment, and Margaret Clitherow was imprisoned.
Is it not true that loyalty to the crown was part of medieval and late medieval Catholic culture? So a lot of Catholics were faced with an impossible choice anyway, and if push came to shove, would actually go along the road of loyalty and conformity, almost as a matter of cultural principle.
I think this was a case very much more of lay Catholics, yes. And I think what is interesting in Margaret Clitherow's case is that she very much seems to have got onto the wavelength of the priests. The priests came into England. In a sense, they had to be psyched up to face this persecution. They certainly were brought up, I think, in a culture of martyrdom. And Margaret Clitherow very much sympathised with this, and I think I'd want to go a step further, wanted to partake of it.
Well, thank you very much, Professor Cross, for giving us your time, and thank you for your comments.
Thank you.
The Earl of Huntingdon, who led the Council of the North, was given powerful support by the then Archbishop of York, Edwin Sandys. Let's go into the Minster and find out the importance of Edwin Sandys in the events leading to the prosecution of Margaret Clitherow.
Edwin Sandys, S-A-N-D-Y-S, pronounced Sands, who was made Archbishop of York by Elizabeth in 1577 and was to remain in post until 1589. That is, who was Archbishop of York when Catholicism, certainly in the form of Spain, was a major threat to the Elizabethan regime. Sandys himself was a Marian exile. He'd been in Germany during the persecution of Protestants by Mary Tudor in the 1550s. And while he was in Germany, he became conversant with Calvin's views as well as with Luther's. And in 1558, when he returned to England, he became quite determined to spread his type of Protestant belief through England, and the golden opportunity came when he became Archbishop of York in the late 1570s. He himself had views which were shared by both Catholics and Protestants in the 16th and 17th century. He said that liberty and plurality and diversity of religion must needs be dangerous to the Commonwealth. In fact, those were exactly the views of Lutherans, of Calvinists, and of Roman Catholics at the time. And Sandys himself set about in a very vigorous way to change the culture of York, which in religious terms at this particular time was essentially Catholic. The North was less subject to the influences of Germany and the East Coast ports than London and Essex and the Southeast. And what happened was that Edwin Sandys was assisted by Henry Hastings, the cousin of Queen Elizabeth, a cousin who was Earl of Huntingdon, and from 1572, Lord President of the Council of the North. And Edwin Sandys, the Archbishop of York, leading the Ecclesiastical Commission, joined with the Earl of Huntingdon, leading the Council of the North, to enforce the new Protestant regime in York. Let's see how that process very painfully, literally painfully, was to take place.
The trial took place in the Guildhall in March 1586, with Margaret accused of harbouring priests, contrary to the Privy Council Act of March 1585.
We're in the Guildhall of the city of York, and this historically was where the oligarchy that ran the city actually met. The Guildhall in our story takes on poignant significance when Margaret appears here on the 14th of March 1586 before two assize judges. Those are John Clinch and Francis Rhodes on the Northern Circuit for the Lenten Assize of 1586. And Margaret, the butcher's wife, is being tried. And she is being tried because she has broken the law in relation to a statute which passed into English law in the early part of 1585, legislation which originated in the Privy Council against the harbouring of Catholic priests. And in fact, the law made it a serious offence, and for the third offence, one could be tainted with something medieval lawyers called corruption of blood, and in fact all one's chattels and properties could be taken, and one's life could be in serious danger. This was all part of the orientation of the Elizabethan government to change the cultural allegiances of people in places like York, and York was very important as the centre of Crown influence in the north of England. So on the 14th of March, Margaret appeared here and she was charged. Margaret refused to plead. That is, she refused to submit to a trial at all. She said, "I will submit my case and my cause to God and your own consciences." Now, what she did, in fact, had a strong moral motivation, whatever one's religious views, and it was this. If her case had gone through a proper trial, then her children and her servants would have given evidence that would have been used against her. They would, in fact, in many cases, have turned Queen's evidence. Also, her Catholic friends and neighbours themselves would, people like Anne Weddell, Anne Tesh, generally the wives of important citizens, would themselves have been incriminated and caught up in the net. Francis Rhodes, who was later involved in the trial of Mary, Queen of Scots, started to call her a naughty and a willful woman. He was enraged that she refused to plead. And when she came back into this building on the morning of the 15th of March, 1586, to hear the verdict of the court, it was Rhodes who actually talked to her. And Rhodes said that because she refused to plead, she would be subjected to the punishment which in Norman French was called peine forte et dure. That is, a great weight would be put on her in the lowest part of the prison where she was held. A stone would be put in her back, and that would break her back. She would be given barley bread and a little puddled water for 3 days, and then finally she would be pressed to death. It was a barbarous sentence, but it was the normal sentence in English common law for those who refused to plead and go to trial. Margaret actually said at the time, "I heartily thank God for this." She, I think, quite deliberately wanted to go through with an act of martyrdom, and she'd seen a number of priests, especially between 1579 and 1581, actually go through that martyrdom, and she believed in her deepest conscience that she was called to go through it. Certainly, she may have been pregnant at the time, and in an age before modern gynecology, before modern pregnancy testing, it was difficult to know this, but a number of women had come to see her and examined her and said she was probably pregnant. There were 4 councillors of the North in this room. It was very much a show trial, and one very much manipulated by the Council of the North. Now, we can say that there was opposition to this sentence. Hurlstone said, "Though this woman has offended, the child within her hath not." And there was a general feeling that the sentence was too severe. Giles Wigginton, who was vicar of Sedbergh and a Protestant minister and preacher who had tried to convert Margaret to the Protestant way, actually protested against the severity of the sentence. And a lot of people, even those who had strong Protestant loyalties and views, believed the sentence to be barbaric. But that was the law as it stood, and that was going to take its course. And Margaret, who certainly had a lot of courage, whatever one's particular religious or philosophical views, one would never deny her that, said, "I do not wish that my death should be deferred."
The execution took place at a location close to the prison, believed to have been on the river near to the Ouse Bridge. What, if any, were the consequences of Margaret Clitherow's execution? The place to start inquiring is here, at the Mary Ward Institute, also called the Bar Convent, just outside Micklegate Bar.
As I'm sitting in the library of the Mary Ward Institute, the Bar Convent in York, and I'm wearing these gloves which have been given me by Sister Christina Kenworthy Brown, the archivist, so I hardly even dare touch this. I've just done that very gently. That is a book published in 1654, 70 years after the event, and is, I quote from the manuscript itself, "The life and death of Mistress Margaret Clitherow, who for the profession of the Catholic faith was martyred at York in the 28th year of the reign of Queen Elizabeth in the year of our Lord God, 1586. Written by her spiritual father, Father John Mush." In fact, all our information, or most of our information on Margaret Clitherow, comes from this book. John Mush was the most important secular priest in the north of England. He had quasi-episcopal authority in a de facto sense. Mush was the confessor to Margaret Clitherow, and he must have influenced her and strengthened her in her faith, and I've no doubt she influenced him. Many priests, including Father Mush, came to Margaret's house, where they were given hospitality and where often they offered the Eucharistic sacrifice and said Mass. The priests she assisted often ended up executed for their priesthood in this difficult time in the 1580s. And Father Ingleby, Father Francis Ingleby, who probably retrieved Margaret's body on the 6th of May, was may well have been responsible for arranging to get it out of York to a safe.
The chapel in the Bar Convent was cleverly designed and built so that its purpose was not evident from the outside, as the building of Catholic chapels was still outlawed at the time.
This is the chapel of the Mary Ward Institute in York. It was built by Thomas Atkinson in 1769, and the sisters here trace their origins to the heroic work of Mary Ward, who was born in 1585 and was only 1 year old when Margaret Clitherow was martyred. Margaret Clitherow's body was retrieved after she was pressed to death on the Ouse Bridge at the toll booth. Her body was put on a dunghill, a midden heap, and it was customary if people were executed, especially for treason, or if they died in a profane place like a prison, it was normal for them to be denied a Christian burial. She was executed on March the 26th, 1586, and her body was found on May the 6th, 6 weeks later. In the biography of Margaret Clitherow by Father John Mush, it is stated quite emphatically that when Catholics found Mrs. Clitherow's body, that body was completely incorrupt, which is one sign of sanctity, certainly in terms of canonical inquiries over processes for beatification. The sisters have this reliquary containing the right hand of Margaret Clitherow, or that is the claim and the hope and the belief. And it gives us some idea of the Catholic culture of relics. After the martyring of a priest or of a person who was witnessing to the Catholic faith, to take a small part of the body as an aid to remember them and as an aid to worship. And this relic was very much in that tradition.
John Mush claims that Margaret Clitherow's body was found on May the 6th on a dunghill. Tradition has it that the body was taken to Hazelwood, an estate near York, which was the seat of the recusant Vavasor family.
When Margaret Clitherow became a Catholic 3 years after her marriage in 1574, she moved into the recusant Catholic community in York. Her closest friend and ally in this was Dorothy Vavasor, the wife of Thomas Vavasor of Spaldington. Dr. Thomas Vavasor was a Cambridge graduate and had refused to conform to the Protestant settlement that Elizabeth was restoring from the time of her half-brother Edward. And the Vavasors provided a mass centre in York, which was very active from the mid-1570s, right the way up to 1581, when it was closed by a raid initiated by the Council of the North. After that point, Margaret Clitherow herself ran 2 mass centres because Dorothy Vavasor was under constant watch, and Margaret ran a mass centre in her husband's house, her own house in the Shambles, and also another one a bit further from York. After Margaret Clitherow's execution, there is a very strong tradition that her body having been retrieved in the May of 1586 and having been temporarily rested at the tomb of Thomas Percy, was then taken at night for safekeeping to here, to Hazelwood Castle. I think it's important at this particular point to pause and reflect on this. Burgess Catholicism, the Catholicism of tradesmen and shopkeepers and merchants in towns and cities, couldn't and didn't survive. And it didn't survive because there was a lack of privacy in towns and everybody knew everybody else's business. But here in Hazelwood, and in big houses like it, Catholicism could survive among the gentry, which was its last resort, really, and its last remnant here in England. It could survive here because of the degree of privacy. Anyway, the Hazelwood Vavasors have a strong tradition that Margaret's body was brought here to Hazelwood and was at dead of night buried on the Vavasor estate, 2 miles to the west of here at Wingert Hill at Stutton. And it's buried under a cross which still stands, or it was temporarily parked there anyway before it was moved on, at dead of night after the execution. But it seems very probable that the body was not regarded as safe here at Hazelwood, even high on a bank surrounded by undergrowth, and was later taken by Nicholas Hawkesworth, another Catholic who had lands in the County Palatine of Lancaster, to nearby Tadcaster, and then to Ribchester along the Roman road, and finally to be buried after a series of ventures in the 16th and 17th century that particular corpse had, the remains of Margaret Clitherow had to be buried at the chapel instead.
There is a tradition that the body was carried by Sir William Hawkesworth from Hazelwood along the Roman road towards Ribchester. He arranged with the Catholic sympathiser Sir Richard Shireborn for the body to be laid temporarily in the crypt of All Hallows Church, Great Mitton.
Here we are in the chapel of the Shireborns, is how you spell it, but I suspect that in early modern England it was pronounced Sherborne. And the Sherborne Chapel was established here at All Hallows in the 14th century for a family, the Sherbornes, who came from Hambleton in Overwire. They had become very prosperous, and in the Elizabethan period it was impossible to run this part of Lancashire without the cooperation and help of Sir Richard Sherborne, who's up there with his wife, and commemorations of his children, some of whom were still born. Richard Sherborne's family then had long associations with this parish of All Hallows, and Sherborne himself, after the break with Rome and the religious dislocation of the mid-16th century, remained a Catholic, although he very sensibly occasionally conformed and went to the established church. Now, Margaret Clitherow's body was taken along the road from the Micklegate in York, the Old Roman Road, almost to Ribchester. In fact, here at Great Mitton, the body was parked in the Sherborne Chapel because Sir William Hawkesworth, who was an important landowner around here, was a client of the Sherbans and an agent of theirs. And Sherborne and Hawkesworth arranged, and the remains were temporarily, I would guess, parked down here. Because if you open that trap door, you come to a crypt. And in that crypt, the body would have been parked for several weeks, possibly several months, until a suitable resting place was found for it. It's important to see the Sherbans as facilitating this operation. And without them, I think it's quite inconceivable that Margaret Clitherow's remains could have been brought to this part of the world. Today, under Anglican jurisdiction, this is not part of the Diocese of Blackburn. It is part of the Diocese of Bradford. And the Yorkshire connection was an important one, and that's why there were strong links between this part of the world and York. York is only 53 miles away along the main Ribchester Road, and Mrs. Clitherow's body would have been taken thence to this place. Talking to Mrs. Ann Barnes, who is the church warden here at All Hallows. And what's your diocese, Anne?
We're in the Diocese of Bradford.
Diocese of Bradford.
The most outlying little spot.
If you were going to York from here, you go over the bridge at Great Mitten, just 100 yards away.
Yes.
And that crosses the Ribble?
It crosses the Ribble.
It does,
yes.
And then you go on from there.
Absolutely.
Right. These are the tombs of the Shireburn, and this was a chantry chapel for them, wasn't it, historically?
Historically, yes.
And basically this remained a family chapel right through the Reformation period, even though they themselves tended to be loyal to the old religion.
Oh, very much so.
So this lovely church was built when, roughly?
1270.
So that's just before Edward I became king.
Yes.
And you've got a gorgeous 14th century tower?
Yes.
And the church here at All Hallows?
Yes.
And All Hallows means?
All Saints.
All Saints,
yeah.
Yes. It's an old English word, isn't
very
it?
Much so.
Right.
Yes.
Well, that's absolutely super. Thank you very much.
A short distance from Great Mitten we find Bailey Hall, and it was here that Margaret Clitherow's body was laid to rest for over 100 years.
Right, this farmhouse was under Shireburn control from 1579, when it passed to a junior branch of the Shireburn family. And John Shireburn, in the 1580s, when Margaret Clitherow's body was probably taken into Lancashire, this Shireburn, after the body had been rested at All Hallows Mitten, the body was taken to what was then a chapel attached to Bailey Hall. And in this chapel, probably on the orders of Sir Richard Sherborne, a crypt, an undercroft, had been built, which is roughly 9 foot by 6 foot. And this was big enough to contain the body. And here, some believe, Margaret Clitherow's body remained from the 1580s right the way through to 1715, the year of the first Jacobite rebellion. And in that year, the owner of this house, John Sherborne, one of the descendants of the Tudor owners, sided with the Jacobites, and of course his land was forfeit to the crown, although for various legal reasons it was later given by the crown to his brother in Preston, another Richard Sherborne, who in fact had nothing to do with the rebellion at all. As a matter of safety, it was thought it would be better if the remains of Margaret Clitherow were disinterred and taken from this resting place to the chapel at Stid. And the person responsible for that was almost certainly Sir Walter Vavassor, who was a Jesuit priest who was saying Mass at the Stid Chapel, which was run by a consortium of Catholics in the late 17th and early 18th century.
And so Margaret Clitherow's remains were removed for a fourth time, probably along this Roman road from Mitton near Whalley down to the chapel at Stid just outside Ribchester.
This delightful chapel dates back to at least the 12th century, and in the Central Middle Ages it was a camera for the Knights Hospitaller of St. John of Jerusalem. The Catholics had a consortium which led them to own the Stid estate from the 1680s. And Margaret Clitherow's body, after the First Jacobite Rebellion, was probably taken here sometime in 1716. I think it's important to realize that a number of priests like John Stanford were probably saying the Mass here in the 18th century. The vicar of Ribchester, St. Wilfrid's Ribchester, who had Jacobite sympathies himself in politics, certainly accommodated the Catholic presence here and turned a blind eye. There are a number of graves here, including those of Lord Peter, who was the vicar apostolic, the bishop, that is, of the northern region for most of the 18th century. Talking to Hilda, Mrs. Hilda Bentley.
Yeah.
And she's a lady who lives in the parish. And it's true, isn't it, this beautiful chapel of Stid was put together largely by the Anglican community and people in the community in Ribchester pulling together. How many years ago was that, Hilda?
Best part of 10 years ago, but it wasn't built by them, it was restored.
Right.
It was still very much in use.
Right.
I understand that this corner here had become incredibly dangerous.
Right.
And so they applied to English Heritage for a grant and were offered a serious grant on as long as they could raise even more money in 6 months. And the whole village took up the challenge and did it.
And your present rector is the Reverend Jill Henwood.
She is, yes.
And before that lady, it was Father John Francis. He was the rector, wasn't he?
was,
And in his time, was it mainly during John Francis's time that this tremendous effort
the
to get
whole
this?
of that effort took part in John's time, yes.
It's got, or it is reputed to have, the body of Margaret Clitherow here,
So
isn't
I
it?
understand.
Although some people think that's complete rubbish. And the only way we would ever know is if we dug up the remains and we ran DNA tests and we had a relation of Margaret Clitherow around to match. So whoever's there, may he or she rest in peace.
Absolutely.
I don't suppose many people now, of whatever denomination they are, think much about the appalling things every denomination did to every other denomination after the Reformation. I mean, we don't go around worrying about who we burnt or who we persecuted or who we put to death. Margaret Clitherow is the pearl of Europe. She is in a city and a county which is remarkable for the centuries of its people who will be regarded as saints. Margaret Clitherow is very special to this place. And for whatever reasons and in whatever way, She stands for those who are prepared to give up everything for the sake of what they most care about. And in doing so, she protected her friends and her family. There was nothing violent about what she did, she suffered. And that, I think, is enormously important here.
It's very much a shrine to getting people to forget the past and try to build bridges.
To build bridges, which led us to designing a particular service to commemorate Margaret Clitherow. We asked ourselves the question last year, what liturgy could we construct which would be acceptable and a celebration within Anglicanism and within Roman Catholicism? And the one thing we agree that we share in common is our baptism.
Sure.
And providentially, the font is in this building where Margaret was baptised.
Right.
So the liturgy we designed was a renewal of baptismal vows and a reaffirmation. Father Ryan, the Catholic priest, blessed the water in the font, and all of those present, 100 plus people, went in turn to the font to make the sign of the cross and renew their baptismal vows. We then each lit a candle to show that Christ is the light of the world and that light is a symbol that goodness and hope overcome evil and death.
And what are your feelings about this lovely place?
Just that it's a most special place with a wonderful atmosphere, and everyone that comes in feels it. My daughter had a wedding blessing here, which was wonderful. And it just is somehow a very peaceful, special place. And it seems to affect everyone.